Hispanic Heritage Month runs from September 15th through October 15th, and throughout the month, we here at WHBG Channel 20 are speaking with some of the city's most preeminent leaders who have Hispanic origin and descent. Joining us right now, Shamaine Daniels, City Councilwoman for the City of Harrisburg. You are originally from Venezuela. I should say welcome and thank you for joining us. Let me start there instead of just going right into it. I apologize. Thank you first and foremost for being with us.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah,
This
hopefully
is
a
great
little laughter lightens the mood a little bit because we just want to have a fun conversation here. You are originally from Venezuela.
Yes.
You came here, when you were 13 years old? Mm-hmm. How did that all come about? And what do you remember about growing up in Venezuela?
So how did it all come about? My family had been moving to the U.S. for a long period of time. They'd been here probably since the 50s, and they were slowly migrating to the U.S. We were a pretty okay family financially, economically, so we didn't have that rush to leave anything. But there was a lot of instability. You could see
Political instability?
Political and economic instability, and you could see things were not going in a good direction. So since we already had family here, it was kind of an easy transition to come to the U.S. So, the back home, when young boys in particular became 18, they would be kind of picked up and forced into the military, and nobody would know anything. So I have two younger brothers, and that's what my mom was looking at, right? That pretty soon they will start looking like they're 18, and they will be picked up.
Real quick, and I don't mean to interrupt, but
No.
Just trying to learn more about what the culture was like in Venezuela at the time. Was it mandatory? Because I know some countries like Israel, for example, mandatory, you're 18, you go into the military. Was it like that in Venezuela?
So growing up in Venezuela, things were pretty lawless. So I really can't answer that question. I don't know if it was mandatory. You just knew if the military was coming by and they were in a recruiting phase, and a teenage male disappeared, they were probably picked up, and they might show up at your door 2 or 3 years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just like, hey, I'm home. But
Yeah, like I'm back home.
So it was just picked up randomly off the so kidnapping I'm trying to forgive me for just being I'm just trying to learn about kind of what that must have been horrifying for your mother.
Yeah, so if you're a parent, it is horrifying because your son doesn't come home from work one day or from school or whatever, and you don't know what happened. And they could have died, they could have run away, or they could have been, recruited into the military. And you just never knew, and you just hoped that they would show up at some point. So, between the economic and political instability and that, staring down at my brothers, my mom started to think, maybe it's time we just leave.
So your brothers were 2 brothers, you said, right?
Yeah.
2 brothers, both of them were around.
The middle one was 10.
Oh, okay.
The little one was a baby, but the 10-year-old, he's the middle brother. If you see him now, he's huge. So he looked older than me.
So you had one older brother.
No, I'm the oldest.
Oh, you're the oldest. Okay, so because this was kind of a, preemptive.
Yeah.
Before they even get close to being old enough, let's get out of here and just be safe.
Yeah.
And you had family in the United States at the time. Where in the U.S.?
All over the U.S.
Okay.
New York, mostly New Jersey, Ohio. We had family in Canada too, but Canada's immigration process was less predictable, and it costs to migrate to both countries. So if you're going to spend a lot of money, you would go to the one where you know what the answer is going to be, at the outset.
Yeah.
With Canada, you would make an application, and you just never knew until you showed up at their interview whether you would be allowed in or not.
Got it.
So a lot of folks chose the U.S. over Canada because of their process.
Okay. All right. So you come to the U.S. Where did you move when you came to the U.S.?
To Philadelphia.
Okay.
We had family in Philadelphia, and like I said, we used to come to the U.S. regularly. So
So
we
there's
vacation.
familiarity there a
Yeah.
little bit.
And my mom, I was just talking to someone, the region I'm from was very dry, very hot, very arid. Our soil was there was brown soil, but it was mostly red soil. So there isn't a lot of vegetation that's growing. The industries were sulfur, bauxite, manganese. There's very much a mining environment. So when my mom would come on vacation, Philadelphia was the place where she saw like the most gardens and flowers and things like that. So it was in her head that she was going to move to Philadelphia because she wanted to have her garden.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Philadelphia,
In
of all
Philadelphia.
places.
Yeah. So that's how we ended up in Philadelphia, and we had family in Philadelphia.
What was it when you moved to Philadelphia? At this point, you are you're growing up. I mean, that's a tough time at 13 years old. I can't imagine how tough that was to, not only move, but move to. I was 11 when I moved from Pittsburgh to Harrisburg, and I thought that was the worst thing, most of terrifying thing as an 11-year-old. You're moving from another country to Philadelphia, which is the fifth largest city in America. Was there a language barrier? Were you comfortable with English at the time?
Not too much. So we had some familiarity with English. My dad used to be one of those people who brought in shipping products. So like if a huge ship came in with whatever, he would be one of the people responsible for making sure they came in safely. So over the years, he had to learn conversational terms in different languages to welcome captains off. And then what would happen is, because he could at least have that initial conversation with them, our family would be the one responsible for hosting them. So I had to know a little bit of English to communicate with them, but our region also had a large percentage of Guyanese immigrants, and they speak English, so English was around me in a lot of ways. So by the time I came here, I didn't know to read and write English, but I could pretend enough that I didn't have to go into ESL classes. And nobody,
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, I mean, that, at the very least, I imagine that is it just takes a big hurdle out of the way, for a lot of kids that kind of come into the country during those years, when you have to worry about so many other things from a social standpoint. Am I going to fit in? Am I going to be okay? To not have to worry too much about English was a big step, for you.
There was that also because of the migration pattern. Our family had been in the U.S. for a long time. So like big problems that immigrant families typically see, we didn't have to see, because our families knew which were the better school districts. They knew that having ESL courses often held you back a little bit when it comes to going to college. So that's why it was so important that I was not placed in ESL. So they prepped me to speaking with school administrators, so I wouldn't have to be placed in ESL. So there are all of these kind of learning curves that immigrant families have to learn and try out, that I was very lucky because I had family here before.
Knowing that you had, or having gone through all that, having experienced all that, you just said, knowing what you know now about the process that it takes for immigrants to come to the country and the challenges that they face, how has that kind of helped you, as you have become a professional?
It has helped me a lot because the reality is we had a much easier process. We actually, when people talk about get in the back of the immigration line, we actually had a line. Mexican Americans oftentimes don't have a line. Other people from other countries don't have a line. So in some ways, I'm very aware of the things I had that other people don't get. And that informs.
Was it easier then to be an immigrant than it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. One, the agencies work more effectively and efficiently. So, like when we submitted our application, you get the decision relatively quickly. The only negative experience was my social security card didn't come before classes started, so the school didn't let me in, which is a violation of Tyler, but I didn't know that at the time. But that was the only real hiccup that we had, again, because of the supportive family who already existed, and we, came through a relatively easy process. It was still difficult, but, compared to what other families experience, ours was easy.
So, what was it ultimately that brought you here to Harrisburg?
Um, what brought me to Harrisburg was a job. Yeah, I went to college at Westchester,
Okay.
and I would come to meetings in Harrisburg, and I would say, "Who on earth would want to live here?" And 10 years later, I get a job offer.
There you go.
And now I ask, like, who on earth would want to leave here? But I received a job. I'm an attorney. And I was particularly interested in civil rights and poverty law, and employment law. So there was an organization here that did that work. So I applied, I got the job, and I came here. And, I chose Harrisburg because I had a really bad experience in Cincinnati. And I said, I'm never going to be stuck in a place. So I chose Harrisburg because it's close to all of these other cities, so that if it turned out to be really bad, I had like an escape plan. So that was how I ended up in Harrisburg.
A lot of people have really bad experiences in Cincinnati and Ohio in general, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just a Pittsburgh guy throwing shade on Ohio.
On Ohio.
But all joking aside, you wanting to get into law. I want to get back to Harrisburg in just a second, but
yeah.
but you getting into law, and wanting to go into civil rights law, poverty law, things like that. How much was your upbringing and growing up in an area where maybe poverty was something that was more common than it is in the United States? How much did that kind of influence wanting to get into that side of
So that was kind of part of my upbringing. I don't know what the stats are. I mean, the stats now are terrible, but I don't know what the stats were for back then. I think the difference between Latin America and the U.S. is that in Latin America, poverty is visible. In the U.S., we do a good job at hiding it. So growing up, I always, we were relatively wealthy, but the kids I went to private school. People would work to save enough for private school tuition. So those kids, we still had poor kids in our private school, and their housing was not habitable. Their family's income was not regular, and there was always this kind of the myth that poor people are lazy was as prevalent there as it is here. And I knew that wasn't true because after I, left school, I would go home and do my homework, and, someone else would cook my food for me. Like, my classmates, they would go home and then they have to get on the streets and start to sell stuff to, earn their income.
You just got to hustle.
Yeah, they have to hustle all the time. They don't have a parent. They may not have a parent who's like has the ability or time to feed them. They're feeding themselves. They're waking up early in the morning themselves. I had an alarm clock. They're waking up on their own. Their house may not have electricity. They're having to get dressed, without water, without electricity, etc. So the myths around poverty, I knew from experience that they were wrong. And then I came to the US, and that's when we hit poverty because, our currency lost value. We came with a lot of savings to the US, and our currency lost a lot of its value within 6 months of us getting here. So then we didn't have really any money, and my mom had to work a minimum wage job at a factory, so we were, so I experienced poverty as a person in the U.S. when we first came here. And all of those, those experiences looking back are so valuable because, there are so many things about poverty in the U.S. that we hide. And I know what those are because of a lot of it because of my own experiences here, but a lot of it because I have been helping people. So, when I came to the U.S., the long-term dream and aspiration was that I would be a diplomat because I wanted to end poverty all over the world. That was my plan because, and this stems from seeing kids intimately how they struggled back home. But I wasn't a U.S. citizen by the time I graduated from college, so I couldn't sit for the Foreign Service exam. And then I had to kind of pivot, and that's how I went into the practice of law.
How difficult was it to go from being okay in Venezuela to thinking you're going to be fine here in America, where it's the American dream, everyone can succeed, and then suddenly it's essentially gone?
Yeah, so one of the things, my mom was really good at hiding our poverty from us. So whenever we couldn't have things or things didn't happen, it was because she decided. It wasn't because we were poor. She's like, no, you're not, I'm not giving you that.
So did you realize that what was going on? I mean, you were 13, 14 years old at this point.
No, I didn't. So I hated my mom. It's just like, why can't I
Oh,
do
man.
this? Why can't I go there? Why can't I hang out with my friends? Why can't I,
But
And
she
then
was just protecting you.
she was just protecting us. And then there was another part where we moved to a relatively good neighborhood. So my friends had like free tickets to the opera, free tickets to the theater, free tickets to concerts, and they could always give me one, come along with us. So there was this weird place where I could pretend, like I could not know that I was poor because I'm going to the opera. Only rich people go to the opera, right? That's like the stereotype. It's just my mom being difficult, right? And then it wasn't until I went to college that I realized that was like, oh, I'm poor.
What was it that made you realize it?
One, well, there were two things. I had to fill out a FAFSA form, and that's when I learned what my family's income was. And I actually had to fight with my mom over that because she did not want me to know what the income was. And then my first semester, my professor was going over the poverty guidelines.
Oh my goodness.
And I remember at that time, I think it was 19,000 was a poverty guideline for a household of our size, and my mom was making about 13,000, I think, and which was like 6 or 7 below the poverty. And I remember this woman saying, "Who on earth could live on 19,000?" And I was thinking, like, it would be nice to have 19,000.
I mean,
And that's when I realized, because the class was so like overwhelmed that there were people who lived on less than, the poverty rate, and I was like, oh.
I mean, you're laughing about it. I mean, you can kind of laugh about it now, but I mean, when you think about that, when you kind of go back in your head and think about that, I mean, how difficult a time was that for you to kind of realize that and figure it out?
I was lucky again. I went to Westchester. I got a full scholarship to Westchester, and they gave us an orientation before the semester started. So when I went to college, I hadn't even owned a computer. I didn't know how to use one. I didn't know what email was. And there were things like that other kids knew that I didn't know. And it was obvious to me during orientation that there were things that these kids knew that I didn't know. And I was just very lucky that there were a lot of kids in that group that were also low income, and they had figured out different things. So we would help each other. I literally remember being in a computer class and the instructor talking about, you need to use the mouse to do this, use the mouse. And I had no idea what the mouse was. And
Where mouse? Where? What? Huh?
And and someone was sitting behind me, and he was poor. He grew up poor too, and he came up and he whispered. He's like, "Mouse is that thing. That's the mouse." And that's how.
I have to imagine that having gone through poverty in this country, has, I mean, not just from a law perspective, but kind of bringing it back to Harrisburg, that shaped who you eventually wanted to become in terms of becoming a councilwoman and helping people out in the city.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because, like I said, we do a good job at hiding poverty. There's so many people who are struggling because, in college, people thought I was rich. I wore my cousin's hand-me-downs. She worked in New York City, so she was having, state-of-the-art hand-me-downs. People always thought I was I was wealthy in college, so I could hide it very well back then. And so they're just kind of these little cues that I'll see from people. I'm like, oh, they're
Like,
having a tough time.
and you don't have to answer this question, but I view it as an opportunity to kind of learn myself.
Oh.
What are some of the cues that you look out for where, if maybe you're kind of, if people want to help out and they may see something and something kind of goes off in your head that person needs help. What are some of the things that you kind of look for and see?
There are some things that are just general. If someone, we stigmatize poverty a lot, so there's this need to pretend it's not happening, and we're not it.
Like you said, we do a great job in this country of hiding it.
Yeah. So someone who is where they're pretending to know something that's attributed or typical of middle class or upper class, but as they're speaking about it, they've never actually like interacted with it. That's usually a tell to me that they're they're struggling financially and they're trying to fit into this new space, but they haven't been exposed to it before. They haven't had someone to guide them through it, so they're trying to navigate it by kind of pretending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you help someone kind of, because you mentioned the stigma that's attached to poverty in this country. How do you help someone kind of get over the, for lack of a better term, the shame that someone might carry when they know that they don't have as much money as someone else?
Yeah, so shame, thrives in darkness. So kind of talking about things openly, if, sometimes I can't think of an example, but sometimes someone might think poorly of something they did as a young child to survive, right? And if they're speaking about it in a way that's negative, just kind of normalizing it and say, yeah, it's okay. Like we also did that, right? There's some things that you grew up with that you think, oh, this is something that only poor people do, so you hide it, but actually everybody does it. Like I'm sure there's like, especially like around foods, there may be, I grew up only eating. Not me personally, but I'll hear friends say, like, I grew up eating only ketchup sandwiches, right? So that's something only poor people do. But, like I had law school classmates who were children of judges who ate ketchup sandwiches because you don't have time to do anything, So
Fair.
kind of like, yeah, I know what the ketchup sandwich is
Yeah.
because, like, yeah, it's normal. Like, you don't have to be ashamed of that. So I'm talking about it. I'm being honest because I think the more we hide it, the harder it is to address, to meet. And what happens is even people who are in leadership often like to pretend that they're wealthier than they are. And then when solutions come to their table, they don't want to talk about how their experience would be impacted by this particular policy. So then they just don't say anything. And then everyone, if you've been through poverty and you see that policy, this isn't going to fix anything. But then they don't want to say, actually, if I were, I wouldn't be able to use that if I was in this situation, et cetera. And that's where their value is really when it comes to making things better, like bringing your whole self to the table, because we're all elected officials. We represent both values and experiences of our constituents. And if we are too ashamed to bring our experiences into those conversations, we're really undermining the effectiveness of the policies that we vote for.
So why ultimately did a Venezuelan immigrant who grew up in poverty in the United States, who moved to a city that you didn't originally want to move to, want to become a councilwoman?
So that was basically, I don't know if you remember the sinkhole on 5th Street or 4th Street.
Yeah.
That's like a block and a half or so from my house.
Okay. That'll get someone involved very quickly.
Yeah, because I had a plumbing incident that same year, and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe they're connected, and it was a huge plumbing expense. But that's, I had run for office before. I knew I could run a campaign, and this sinkhole happened, and as people were talking about it, I thought, maybe they need more skill sets up there to help fix some of this, because the problem wasn't that the technology wasn't there, the problem wasn't that the equipment wasn't there or the people weren't there. The problem was, there wasn't a trust that if you did the work you would get paid, and that's why that sinkhole stayed there for as long as it did. And that was my thought process, like because the other thing was, this is one problem, and if it can be fixed, what's the next problem ahead? And if there's a skill set I have that could help, fix it, I'd rather prevent it than fix the problem.
So this has obviously been a very heavy conversation. We talked a lot about poverty, and but it's been incredibly enlightening. But it's also been heavy, and I want to try to end on a light note. And
Okay.
there's to me, I mean, there's nothing. There are a few things which, no matter where you go, whether in Latin America, South America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, the pride for cuisine and food is I mean, second to nowhere else in the world. It is prideful. So I've asked other people that we've had on the program, what is it from your home that you still kind of bring with you emotionally and physically, if you make it at home, that more than anything else?
Oh, so I can't make it because the products aren't really here. So even though I'm from Venezuela, where arepa is like the staple, the region I'm from is from the southeastern part. Like I said, it's very arid. And we have this dish called cachapa, which is, I guess, maybe a less processed version of an arepa, but it's basically like a pancake made of corn. And you eat it with a regional cheese, and often you can just do it as we used to eat it for breakfast. But it's that's something, when I see that, when I hear it, like I know like that
It immediately goes off like, oh, I got to get it.
yeah, because the other part about it, growing up, when I came to the US, I loved that supermarkets had all produce all the time. But the older I get, the more I'm like, that's probably not healthy. So with us, we eat very seasonally. So there's only one time of the year where you could really have those fresh cachapas, and they're fresh and they're ripe, and you get the right corn at the right time, and you get that cheese is freshly made.
What cheese do you remember? What cheese?
In Venice, we call it queso a mano, and it's the most generic name. It's like handmade cheese. That's what
I'm sure it's delicious.
it is. It's like almost like a mozzarella.
Okay.
But not quite. So that's our regional thing, and but the big thing is like the seasonal eating. Even when we eat our fish, it's fishermen they fish, and then they bring their trucks, and then you go and you pick your fish, and sometimes they're still flopping in that truck. And the meat, the vegetables taste so much differently because you're eating them at the peak moment.
It's a lot more fresh.
Yeah.
When you remember growing up, it's that it's that much more fresh kind of taste than now, where you get it's a little more processed and things like that.
Well, and, when I came to the U.S., so for me, apples were more like were an image of America, right? But then I realized I don't really like how they taste. I just like the image of them.
Interesting.
And then I went out to work in Washington State, where
Apples are everything.
Everything, and to eat an apple when you illegally steal it from a farm as you're walking by, fresh from the tree.
Exactly.
It tastes so good.
You could do that at an orchard down the road.
Yeah.
Here in
Yeah.
central Pennsylvania. I mean, there's plenty of great
Yeah.
apples here.
Yeah.
So, no, that's wonderful, and I think a good kind of happy place to end this conversation. Shamaine Daniels, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.